You're listening to Pacifica's Capitalism, Race, and Democracy. I'm your host, Akua Holt. University of Houston professor and scholar activist Dr. Gerald Horne, author of The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism, aims to correct the falsifications rooted in common misunderstandings of the birth of Texas. According to Choice360.org, the book situates Texas in the confluence of various historical actors and forces. The Counter-Revolution of 1836 reveals an oft-hidden motive for the Republic of Texas and its creation and the preservation of slavery. The issues of slavery, slave rebellion, and settler colonialism is placed at the center of Texas history. Here's Dr. Gerald Horne, Dr. Greg Carr, and Joni Eisenberg, host and producer of WPFW's To Heal DC 2022 Juneteenth special.
Gerald Horne, of course, is no stranger to WPFW and to Pacifica. He is the author of more than 46 books, and we're going to be talking about his latest book, which is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, the United States Roots of American Fascism, fascism, period. Gerald Horne is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's published more than 36 books. I think now it's up to 46, including White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela, and The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, the Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. Many, many more books he has written, including a book about Paul Robeson. And again, we're going to be really focusing in on his hot off the press book. Gerald Horne is also very much a part of the PFW family and the Pacifica family. This is a riveting book. We're going to be discussing how it relates to Juneteenth. And we, of course, are very blessed and thankful to have our own, claiming him, Dr. Greg Carr, who is still a professor at Howard University, Africana Studies, as well as an attorney, as is Gerald Horne. And Greg Carr these days can be heard on many, many platforms, including, of course, Pacifica, but also on the Black Table with Roland Martin, as well as a program on Monday nights. So we are thankful to have Greg with us. Gerald, welcome, and thank you for sharing this time with us. What inspired you to write this book, which is extremely relevant today, as this one in particular?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, what inspired me to write this book is in part my current residence in Southeast Texas. And residing in Southeast Texas, I became aware of much of the mythology surrounding the so-called Texas Revolution of 1836. And what struck me is that the so-called Texas Revolution of 1836 bore the earmarks of what I had described as the Counter-Revolution of 1776. That is to say, enslavers revolting in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore. Certainly that was the case with regard to Texas in 1836, because recall that just a few years earlier, Mexico, under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, had moved to abolish enslavement of Africans. Footnote, of course, it took the United States until the 21st century to elect a president of African descent. And perhaps, as we shall discuss subsequently in this program, that triggered a tsunami of outrage and counter-reaction and counter-revolution that has led the United States, as we speak, to the brink of a unique form of neo-fascism. In any case, those events helped to inspire me to do the research to produce this book that's now before you.
For me personally, this is particularly a special book for me, especially around Father's Day. My father was trying to explain to me when I was 5 years old what was going on in Texas and why Texas is not a part of the United States, that we stole it from Mexico. And he was very supportive of Mexico and was very upset about us watching the very popular show in the mid-50s brought to us by Walt Disney, and that is the Davy Crockett Show, which I understand was Disney's most popular endeavor, part of our ongoing brainwashing in this country. But it clarifies, your book, among many other things, clarifies so much about Texas and Mexico. And you spend 650 pages talking about this, but begin to talk to us about what many people don't know about. We can start with Mexico, about the fact that Mexico was really, the president that you just spoke of was supporting abolition of slavery.
That is correct. And let me cut to the chase, since you don't want to be accused of false advertising. The premise of this program, of course, is Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. Yes. And I think that the current iteration of Juneteenth has more than an iota of mythology about it. The mythology being that on June 19th, 1865, General Granger of the U.S. Army shows up in Galveston, Texas, a major slave port, and apprises the enslaved African of something they apparently did not know, which is that they were free. Now, there's so much wrong with that mythology that I'm not even sure where to begin. I mean, first of all, the so-called Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, it did not necessarily apply in jurisdictions where the Lincoln government did not reach. And certainly the remit of the Lincoln government in January 1863 did not reach into Texas, and it certainly did not reach into Galveston, because Galveston and Texas were in revolt against the Lincoln government. And of course, as we shall detail, and as detailed at length in the book, was the Confederate state least damaged by the U.S. Civil War, the Confederate state that contributed disproportionately to the fortunes of the Confederate States of America, so-called. Actually, a better way to look at Juneteenth, if one wants to maintain that framework of General Granger, who, by the way, was accompanied by thousands upon thousands of U.S. soldiers, many of whom were of African descent, with guns in hand. One wonders why, if the mission was solely to tell the black people that they were free, why he had to be backed up with so many armed black soldiers. But in any case, what General Granger was doing was imposing a new order on Galveston at gunpoint. In other words, slavery had proceeded from the barrel of a gun. That's how you get people to work for free. And in order to impose the new order, the government of the United States decided that the better part of wisdom was to send in an armed bevy of soldiers. And so it would be as if U.S. Congress passed a law tomorrow saying that slavery would be abolished in Northwest Africa and Mauritania. Well, I don't want to give Congress any ideas, but that would not have any meaning unless the U.S. military showed up to enforce that particular decree. Precisely that's what happened in 1865. The other point you need to recognize is that slavery, to a lesser degree, continued post-1865. It's one thing to pass an Emancipation Proclamation. It's another thing to send armed troops in. But the Texas enslavers were so determined to exploit their labor force that that was not sufficient. The other point that listeners really need to focus on in terms of connecting the dots is this, that the Texas enslavers knew full well that Mexico, during the U.S. Civil War, had been occupied illicitly by France. The idea amongst the enslavers in Texas was either A, to move en masse with their property to French-occupied Mexico in order to continue enslavement of Africans, or B, with a backup from French-occupied Mexico to continue slavery in Texas, witness General Granger arriving on the border with so many black soldiers in tow. What happens, to connect the dots, is the Mexican-American holiday Cinco de Mayo, which, as you recall, marks a victory by Mexican forces over the French occupiers in 1862. And that brings me to the next point, which is that I celebrate Juneteenth. I think that whenever we can wrest a new holiday away from the federal government, that's always good news.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely good news. At the same time, we celebrate Juneteenth because we know that on June 19th, 1867, you had the capture and execution of the Mexican puppet ruler, Maximilian, and that brought us closer than June 19th, 1865, to a day when slavery would finally be extinguished. And you should also know that June 19th, 1867 was the product of a tremendous exemplar of Black-Brown unity, insofar as what happened is that Mexican forces from the South, under the leadership of Benito Juarez, were moving northward, and Black soldiers alongst the border were moving southward, and that caught the French occupying forces in a pincers that crushed them. Listeners should also know that the French took advantage of their colonial rule in Africa by dispatching to Mexico hundreds of African troops to bolster their rule. It's not clear what happened to all of those African soldiers who were dispatched across the Atlantic to prop up a French puppet regime in Mexico. I speculate that some of them stayed on in Mexico. Some of them might have moved on to Texas. Of course, hundreds returned intact to their homeland on the African continent. So the story of Juneteenth is much more complex, much richer than the mythology has presented. And one has to wonder, what is the purpose of this mythology?
Yes, that's absolutely.
Yes.
That's absolutely right. Gerald, it's good. It's good to hear your voice, brother, and it's good to be with you again. This is really a unique opportunity. You know, Gerald and I talked. I couldn't put the book down. Sitting here reading it and got to page 622 and was like, man, this, of all of your works, there are dozens of books now, this one connects so much in every last one of the previous books in one way or another. And again, you all, this is rare. We have this much time with a brother who I think there's a general consensus among those of us who are just being honest about it. The most important working scholar we have, and really is the kind of redefining how we think about so many of these things. In the chapter, which actually carries the title of the book, the main title, chapter 3, Counter-Revolution of 1836, you write this: counter-revolution prevailed, given external assistance from Washington, strict solidarity among settlers, and vociferousness among their many foes. This was not to be the end of this distasteful recipe. I want to ask what you mean by that in terms of not only what you've said so far, but you really place the occupied territory that became known as the country of Texas for a decade, and then after that, of course, the state of Texas. You place it in this international, almost Game of Thrones. But could you talk about how this Texas project of settler colonialism brings in England, brings in a Washington that has its own colonial ambitions, so that when General Granger, who at one time had served under, not mistaken, J.C. Fremont, who had told Lincoln, arm these black people and we can get this thing done, really how Texas represents settler colonialism in every dimension, and how black and other non-white folks, indigenous people, simply didn't find the type of solidarity that could have staved it off. Could you talk a little bit about this, the state of Texas, the country of Texas, in the context of this international political game that's going on in the 19th century?
Well, first of all, settler colonialism, and in terms of seeking to unite history with the present, it's very curious, is it not, that simple term, settler colonialism, is generally absent from the ordinary vocabularies of many of our friends on the left. One wonders how they conceptualize what happened centuries ago when you had European invaders across class lines, from the wealthy to the less affluent, who invade North America and occupy the land, oust the indigenous population, and then from the barrel of a gun, march Africans across the Atlantic to work for free. And what I tried to stress with regard to settler colonialism was that it was a project that was based on class collaboration, as noted, between wealthier and less affluent Europeans. What happens is that many of our friends on the left, they basically occupy a half-truth. The half-truth being that it is accurate to say that those who had been persecuted on the shores of Europe, Serb versus Croat, English versus Irish, Russian versus German, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, religious minorities such as the Jewish population, Protestants versus Christians, it is accurate to say that when they cross the Atlantic, many of them receive a better deal than they received in Europe. And that's why you have many of our friends on the left celebrate the formation of the United States of America as a great leap forward for humanity. But what they somehow leave out is that this was at the expense of the indigenous population, and certainly it was at the expense of the enslaved African population. It even gets to the point where you have our friends on the left celebrate the Bill of Rights as this great leap forward for humanity, even though it includes the ticking time bomb known as the Second Amendment, which basically guarantees that settlers can be armed in militias or otherwise in order to put down Native American revolts or revolts of the enslaved. I mean, that was the actual purpose of the Second Amendment. And it's also striking to note that this project of settler colonialism, it was able to attain liftoff, not least because of the divisiveness amongst the indigenous populations. And it's also important to point out the role of revolutionary Haiti, which was the most militant of the abolitionist forces, which was firmly bent on defeating the settlers. But alas, as many of your listeners know, revolutionary Haiti was handicapped by the fact that it had to pay reparations to French enslavers, number one. Number two, it was in the process of being destabilized by Washington. That was a major theme of the United States before the U.S. Civil War, up to and including in the 1840s, when Washington, in an exemplar of covert action, basically splits the island and helps to bring into existence the Dominican Republic. And then that gets Haiti and the Dominican Republic quarreling for decades to come. But having said that, Haiti was able to forge a kind of alliance with abolitionists in London to help to put pressure on Texas. And that indeed forces Texas to liquidate its nationhood in 1845 and crawl into the Union. Although, as I point out, it should have required a supermajority for this independent nation to join the United States. It was actually a simple majority. So you could say to this very day, for what it's worth, that Texas's presence in the United States, in a sense, is illegal. I'm not sure what to make of that. Actually, it might lead to further secessionist impulses on the part of these reactionaries in the Lone Star State. And I'm not sure if that would be in the best interest of progressive forces, not to mention myself.
That was an excerpt of Dr. Gerald Horne, Dr. Greg Carr, and Joni Eisenberg, host and producer of WPFW's To Heal DC 2022 Juneteenth special. Dr. Horne holds the Morris Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of nearly 40 scholarly books, including, I Dare Say, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism, published in 2022. Independent presidential candidate Dr. Cornel West has referred to Horne as one of the greatest historians of our time.